Most people think of the Second World War as a story of factories, ration books, and long supply lines stretching across oceans. What is often missed is that, for millions of civilians, the war was not survived by industrial abundance but by agricultural improvisation. In occupied Europe, blockaded cities, and even in supposedly secure Allied nations, access to shops became unreliable or meaningless. Food existed, but not where people lived, not in forms they could buy, and not in quantities that met daily needs. What kept families alive were farming practices that predated modern agribusiness, revived out of necessity, and adapted under extreme pressure. These were not romantic pastoral traditions, they were calculated responses to scarcity, risk, and state control. In this video, we'll look closely at 9 of those forgotten farming tricks, not as nostalgia, but as hard-earned lessons. If you value this kind of grounded historical analysis, subscribe to The Survival Record, because this channel exists to preserve exactly these overlooked survival stories. The first lesson was that calories mattered more than crops that looked respectable. Across much of wartime Europe, traditional market crops disappeared from private gardens almost overnight. Families replaced them with plants chosen purely for yield per square meter and, well, caloric density. Potatoes, beets, turnips, and Jerusalem artichokes dominated because they produced usable energy even in poor soil and short seasons. In Germany and occupied Poland, potatoes were pushed into every available plot, not because they were culturally preferred, but because they converted soil, labor, and scraps into calories with, ruthless efficiency. Leafy greens were still grown, but largely as vitamin supplements rather than dietary foundations. This shift reveals an important wartime logic. Survival agriculture prioritizes metabolic return, not variety or taste. That logic would later influence Cold War civil defense planning, which, emphasized tubers and grains over perishable produce. Another survival tactic was growing crops that could be hidden, not just harvested. Visibility mattered. In occupied territories, gardens were inspected, requisitioned, or taxed. Some families deliberately chose crops that grew underground or blended into ornamental spaces. Root vegetables could be partially harvested without obvious signs of depletion. In the Netherlands, during the Hunger Winter, families planted potatoes beneath flower beds or mixed them with decorative plants to reduce suspicion. In the vast expanses of Eastern Europe, small grain patches were cleverly interspersed with weeds or forage plants. This was done to avoid aerial detection and, to prevent casual confiscation. It was a strategy known as farming as camouflage. Interestingly, this concept was later studied by resistance movements and even military logisticians who were keen on the concealment of supply sources. The lesson, really, was quite simple. Food you can't protect is food you don't really own. It's a stark reminder of the necessity to safeguard vital resources. During the war, seed saving quietly emerged as one of the most important survival skills. It was a practice that ensured the continuity of life, even in the harshest of times. Modern agriculture, tends to assume stable access to seed suppliers, but wartime civilians learned pretty quickly that this assumption just collapses under blockade and occupation. So families began selecting the healthiest plants, not for immediate consumption, but for seed retention. In France and Yugoslavia, informal seed-sharing networks sprang up, often tied to churches or extended families. These networks preserved local varieties that were, adapted to poor soils and minimal fertilizer, traits that commercial hybrids often just didn't have. Seed saving, then, was not just practical, it was political. Urban livestock reappeared, even in places where it had long been considered backward or even illegal. Before the war, urban animal husbandry was often restricted by health laws. Wartime necessity, though, reversed those priorities. Rabbits, chickens, and sometimes goats returned to city courtyards, rooftops, and basements. Rabbits were particularly valued because they converted kitchen scraps into protein efficiently and quietly. In Britain, keeping chickens in small gardens became normalized, supported by government pamphlets that quietly relaxed pre-war standards. In occupied cities, livestock were kept indoors or in concealed sheds to avoid seizure. This return to micro-livestock demonstrated a key survival principle. Protein production does not require large landholdings, only tolerance for inconvenience and, well, smell. Human waste and organic refuse were reused in ways that would later be considered honestly pretty unacceptable. Chemical fertilizers were diverted to military use, leaving civilians with really very few options. Composting became mandatory rather than optional. The practice highlighted a grim but essential truth: closed-loop nutrient systems are resilient even if they can be, well, socially uncomfortable. Gardens were planted for staggered failure, not for maximum success. Instead of relying on just a single planting, families diversified timing. Crops were sown early, late, and honestly, sometimes even poorly on purpose, to make sure that not everything failed at once due to frost, drought, or confiscation. In the Soviet territories under siege, especially around Leningrad, the approach taken was to plant even when the conditions seemed to suggest a likely failure. The logic behind this was probabilistic rather than optimistic. If just one planting managed to survive, it justified all the labor put into it. Wild plants were not just gathered randomly, but were systematically integrated into diets. The lesson here is that ecological literacy, not merely land ownership, is what determines food security. Small-scale grain processing returned to households when centralized mills failed. When transportation networks broke down, access to flour became erratic even if grain existed locally. Hand mills, once obsolete, reappeared in homes and communal spaces. Families processed rye, barley, and even chestnuts into meals suitable for bread and porridge. Bread quality declined, but calorie availability improved. This decentralization of food processing reduced vulnerability to infrastructure collapse. Modern survivalists often focus on stockpiling food, but, those two civilians demonstrated that the ability to process raw inputs mattered just as much. Finally, labor itself was reorganized around food production rather than employment. The war revealed that food production becomes the central organizing principle of society under stress, overriding normal economic roles. Remembering these farming tricks matters because they expose the fragile assumptions behind modern food systems. WWII civilians did not survive because they were heroic or resourceful in abstract terms. They survived because they adapted quickly, abandoned comforts, and relearned older systems under pressure. These stories are not about romantic self-sufficiency. They are about realistic responses to systemic failure. If you value this kind of careful, unglamorous history, subscribe to the Survival Record and share this video with others who believe that understanding the past is one of the best ways to prepare for the future.